All right, welcome back. Now we're discussing Amy Lowell, and the poem of hers that we read this week is called The Sisters. All right, if you look at the written out lecture, there is a lovely picture of Amy Lowell here, and it's neat to see her mode of dress. You can see she's very much from that, or at least in this picture, it looks very much like the more formal wear that people would wear prior to up until and throughout World War I. Because remember, we said kind of fashion started changing after World War I, and maybe in part was precipitated by women going into the workforce, and so having to alter the way they dressed, or just maybe really thinking, hey, why did I dress in this clothing that is maybe not as easy to work in? So anyway, she still looks very much like the more traditional figures prior to the war and during, is maybe that mode of dress that you would see on the picture that we have of Amy Lowell, and her hair looks very long still and put up in a bun in the back. Um, anyway, it's a photo, so it's neat to see what she really looked like. The written out lecture also has, of course, links that I gave. If you'd like more information on any of these, they're always, for your own personal research or understanding. If you'd like to know more, there's thepoets.org, with biographical and literary information on Amy Lowell, as well as links to more of her poetry if you want to read more. There's a YouTube link of Amy Lowell reading her poem this week, The Sisters, and a YouTube link that features a lecture on Images poetry and the impact of Amy Lowell's poetry. All right, so Amy Lowell, she's an American. She was an American, I should say. She lived from 1874 till 1925. So you see, she kind of straddles the 1800s and the 1900s, which is maybe why her mode of dress looked a little bit older. She only lived till she was about 51 years old, when she died of a cerebral hemorrhage. That's like a hemorrhage in your brain. So something ruptures in your brain bleeds, and of course it dies because it doesn't have oxygen. And people speculate it may have been done to ill health and obesity, because she was larger at the time, and they didn't have a lot of things a lot of medical testing and treatments the way they do nowadays for things like high blood pressure and diabetes, and who knows? I mean, who knows what she had, right? But she did die of that cerebral hemorrhage at 51. She was born to a family of renown, wealth, and privilege in Boston, Massachusetts. She was a product of the late 19th century. Her family did not believe that women, or not she, but her family was a product of the late 19th century, and so did not believe that women should have formal education. So she was not sent away to school, as were the males in her family. Her cousin was the famous poet James Russell Lowell. You may have heard of him. And her brother, Abbott Lawrence Lowell, became the president of Harvard, while her other brother, Percival Lowell, became an astronomer, and he founded the Lowell Observatory at Harvard and even discovered the quote unquote planet Pluto. It used to be a planet, now it's like, what, a dwarf planet? So, anyway, Percival Lowell, her brother, discovered Pluto. So that's kind of an interesting little claim to fame there, too. Um, a lifelong bibliophile, that means a lover of books, Amy Lowell educated herself in her family's vast library of at least 7,000 books. That's a lot of books. Man, it's a lot of reading. So you can see how she learned so much, even though she wasn't sent off for a formal education. She read and she read and she read, and she self-educated. She even expanded the family library by several rooms so that it took on baronial proportions. So baronial, that's just comes from the adjective for the word baron. So in other words, some very, very rich noble. She wasn't a rich noble. We didn't have nobility in the United States, of course, but something that you might see in a baron's estate was her library. She expanded it because she loved reading so much. Reading opens doors and windows. If you couldn't be educated, but you could get your hands on books, wow. I mean, that's like somebody not having water and all of a sudden they have it, and they can quench their thirst and not be dehydrated anymore. So think of her that way. She was very thirsty for this knowledge. Amy decided from a young age that literature was the life for her. She read it, studied it, enjoyed it, and wrote it. In fact, At only the age of 13, she, along with her mother and sister, wrote the work Dream Drops, or Stories from Fairyland by a Dreamer, which was printed privately by a Boston publisher. So that's kind of neat. I mean, to have something published when you're only 13. And it was also co-written with your mother and your sister. So even though, the family was product of the 1800s thinking about women, the mother and the two daughters at least wrote something and the family published it privately. Amy read the poems of Ezra Pound and became enamored of their obscure imagery. So I talked earlier in the lecture on the times of the early 20th century about how this movement came about in literature that looked for obscure imagery. So like you had to be very well read to make those connections. Maybe it had to do with ancient mythology or, some sort of more removed history, but like you had to be a smart person. You had to be well read to catch these allusions and references and understand what they meant in the poetry. You might have to do some research even to dig them out. So that became very popular at the time period, that kind of obscure imagery to like, use in poems and fiction and things like that. So you had to maybe do some research or at least be well read yourself to catch their meanings and see how they informed the context of what you're reading or the characters or whatever, meaning um, the work was trying to achieve through those references to that obscure either history or mythology or other books that were more removed from people's general knowledge, things like that, or art or whatever, things that were less known. She decided she would write poetry with such imagery. So she did. She liked it so much, she did it. She used obscure imagery. She even traveled to Europe to meet with Ezra Pound and other noted imagist poets. That's what they were called, imagist poets, and modernist writers, so that she could further apprehend the style she so appreciated. Amy never married. Rather, she became close friends with Ada Dwyer Russell, who moved in with Amy Lowell in 1914 and lived with her till Amy's death in 1925. The two traveled together. Ada helped transcribe Amy's poetry and even helped edit Amy's poems. The two companions functioned together much as their other female contemporaries, Gertrude Stein and Alice B. Toklas, who were female companions. And Gertrude Stein was the writer then, and Alice B. Toklas assisted her. Perhaps also much as the earlier Catherine Harris Bradley and her niece Edith Emma Cooper, known together by the single nom de plume of Michael Field. So those two were a pair and wrote together under the nom de plume of Michael Field. But now Amy didn't write under a nom de plume. She was Amy Lowell, and Gertrude Stein was Gertrude Stein. And they have these female companions that assisted them in their works. It is generally concluded that Amy Lowell and Ada Russell were probably lesbian companions. So it's interesting. The poem of hers that we read this week is called The Sisters. And in it, she makes those obscure references to three poets. So if you're not well read in poetry, you might not know them. The first of which was really obscure, Sappho. Now, Sappho, a lot of times it's called the lesbian poet too. So, I mean, I don't know if that was necessarily a draw for Amy Lowell, but she lived on the island of Lesbos. So that's where we get that adjective, lesbian. And a lot of her poetry deals with love and maybe like a female camaraderie, and I think that's why maybe the word lesbian evolved from the island that she lived on, Lesbos. Not saying that Sappho herself was a lesbian. I mean, we don't know. She lived so long ago. She's an ancient Greek poet. But because of some of the themes in her poetry, that lesbian adjective derived from her island of Lesbos. And then the other poets are Elizabeth Barrett Browning and Emily Dickinson. So, of course, to know this about these poets, you have to be kind of well read. And again, there goes to that like obscure imagery that she's involving, and maybe a little bit even, that poetic sisterhood. I don't know if that has to do with sisterhood in other ways for Amy Lowell, like the sisterhood she may have felt with Ada Russell as her companion and possible lesbian companion. So, just something to think about. And of course, we've already studied two of these poets. We studied Elizabeth Barrett Browning and Emily Dickinson both when we were studying the latter half of the 1800s. And of course, I mentioned the other poet is Sappho, the ancient Greek poet who lived on the famed Greek isle of Lesbos in and around 600 BCE. So that is a lot of years ago. That's here we are, 1920s, add 600 years, so that's 1800 years. So she's writing about a poet who lived 1800 years before she did. So you see how that's very obscure and removed from this time period. Much of Sappho's poetry has unfortunately been lost, but her esteemed reputation as a poet and fragments of her poems remain. Here's an example of one of her poems, which often concerned the nature of love. And this is Sappho's poem I'm going to read to you right now. Very short. Again, we have fragments, right? Unknown if it's longer, and we just lost the fragments, but it's called With His Venom. So it starts off, with his venom, irresistible and bittersweet, that loosener of limbs, love, reptile-like, strikes me down. So, in other words, comparing love to kind of like a snake, right? And you get infected by its venom, and venom loosens your limbs, kind of like love can loosen you. It can be irresistible, but also bittersweet. And it strikes you down like bittersweet, I guess, if it's not reciprocated, and irresistible because, what's more intoxicating than, falling in love, right? So it's kind of a neat comparison that Sappho makes in this poem. Anyway, in the poem The Sisters by Amy Lowell, um, Lowell calls herself sister to these three female poets, in that all women poets, however different in history, geography, and convention, share the same experience as females writing in the world. Amy Lowell won the Pulitzer Prize in Poetry posthumously. Posthumously means after she died, because remember, she died in 1925. She won it in 1926 for her posthumously published volume of poetry, What's O'Clock? What's O'Clock? Yeah, neat title. Anyway, enjoy Amy Lowell, reading about her life and times, and the poem of hers that we read this week, The Sisters.